If you appreciate my videos, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you want to help me keep on teaching, writing, and making videos, then please think about becoming a patron.
So please say hello in the comments if you're watching. And for anybody that doesn't know me, I'm Chris Hughes, and I write and make videos and teach online about Celtic things, mostly mythology and deities. And I'm running a class called Celtic Beginnings, which starts at the end of June, which is aimed at people who are new to Celtic studies or Celtic paganism. So I thought I'd get people to send me a few questions and do a few Facebook Live sessions as a warm-up. So there's a link for more information about the class I mentioned and some of my other activities online in the description for this live session. And I'm going to be responding today to a question from a student of mine called Gary, who's taken a few of my classes. So this is the question that we're going to talk about today. This was Gary's question, which I think I reinterpreted just a tiny bit, but hopefully I have his idea right. So his question was, why are the Tuatha De Danann called gods in Irish myth, but no one's ever called a god in Welsh myths? A good question, and he's absolutely right. In Irish medieval texts, the Tuatha De Danann are occasionally referred to as gods, but not in the Mabinogi. So to answer this question, I want to just talk a little bit about history and geography to set us up for a clear answer. So when I say Britain and Britons in this talk, I mean the people who lived on that particular island. And I'm not talking about the much later British Empire or Great Britain or the UK in the modern political sense. As you probably know, this bit that I'm circling with my cursor down here is Wales. That's where the old indigenous British culture, one of the main places that it ended up being preserved in the Welsh language. Scotland, England, and Wales, they're modern concepts. They're the result of activities of invading cultures to Britain. The Britons didn't invent or divide the country up in this way before they were invaded. It seems unlikely that all of the people of Britain would have seen themselves as one people, and the same with the Irish. It was much more regional or tribal. This is a mapmaker's attempt to guess based on various classical writings where different tribes or small kingdoms were in Britain and Ireland. They weren't organized as some kind of great monolithic island-wide culture. However, it seems like both islands were Celtic speaking by the last few centuries BCE. We can't be sure whether there was a period when both islands spoke the same language or whether the split happened somewhere else on the continent. They definitely are both Celtic languages, but we don't really understand why they split or when or where they split because they're dramatically different. By the medieval period, the Irish speaking Irish and the Britons speaking their Brythonic dialects can't understand each other. They've in fact forgotten that their languages are even related. And it wasn't until the modern era that linguists figured out that these were both related languages and that they were both related to the languages of Celtic Gaul. So why am I talking about languages? I'm supposed to be talking about deities, and now I'm talking about history and languages. Understanding what languages people spoke historically helps us to understand their culture. And since culture and language go together, it's really important because culture and language and mythology are all kind of a package. There's some kind of cultural shared history here. So going back to history, Britain, not Ireland, just Britain, was invaded by the Romans in the 1st century. The Romans were basically attempting a cultural genocide. They weren't trying to kill all the Britons, but they were trying to turn them all into Romans. people who thought like Romans and acted like Romans. And ultimately, I'm sure they hoped that they would all speak Latin. So Romans tended to worship local deities wherever they went, alongside their own. So we get inscriptions to these deities because the Roman way was to make altars to deities and write inscriptions to the gods on them. The Celts didn't do this. We have no evidence for this until they had contact with the Romans. Now, what do I mean by a Roman? The Romans who were in Britain were mostly just guys in the Roman army, and they came from all over Europe, including Celtic, Gaul, and Celtic adjacent kind of cultures. So it's sometimes hard to tell when we meet a Celtic deity in Britain, was this an indigenous deity or was it something that some of the army brought with them? But sometimes we can be pretty sure based on place names and things that it was probably indigenous. So Rome and pre-Roman Britain both had relations with Gaul. It gets kind of messy. So by the 3rd century, Roman Christianity came into Britain, but it was very patchy, depending on who was emperor and what they wanted to believe about religion and how tolerant or intolerant they were and how much control the Romans had over certain districts in Britain. People were more or less Christian, but it was very patchy. It wasn't anything like widespread of all over Britain through all the social classes. Now, by the 4th or 5th century, the Romans began to withdraw from Britain. And then we get Angles and Saxons from Germanic areas coming in, moving into Britain. Combination of settlement and aggressive behavior with swords. And we also get the Scots coming from Ireland and beginning to invade southwest Scotland. The people who came from Ireland were called the Scots, and that's why Scotland is now called Scotland. And they began to invade this part. So we have Angles up here, we have Scots here, we have Saxons really all over, pretty much. And by now, things are getting seriously Christian. By the 6th century, the Saxons are largely in power in what's now England and Wales and southern Scotland, except for the part that the Scots from Ireland control. During these 5 centuries, Ireland wasn't invaded. It wasn't settled by the Romans. It wasn't settled by the Saxons. The Irish probably did a bit of trading and had some other types of contact with Britain and with the continent, but they controlled their own affairs. So Christianity itself was the first major influence from the outside that was felt in Ireland for a long time, whereas Britain had a little bit more Christianity a little sooner because of the Roman influence, but by now it had really taken hold in both countries. It was still patchy, depended on who controlled a certain area and their attitudes and how remote the area maybe was. It depended on social stratification. So it wasn't like just the king's a Christian, now we're all Christians. It wasn't that simple. People didn't always have extremely strong loyalties one way or the other. They were Christian, but they still did a lot of pagan things. It was very mixed. Now, neither the early Britons nor the early Irish kept written records. We still, we're guessing at a lot of this stuff until Christianity really gets going and we get the monasteries. So in the monasteries, things begin to be written down, and we'll come back to that and talk about what was written down, because that's really where we're going. So during the 9th and 10th centuries, both Britain and Ireland had Viking attacks and some Norse settlement. But the really big news was the Normans. So the Norman French invaded Britain extremely successfully in the 11th century. This was the first time that the invading force really made bigger inroads in Scotland and really got the island organized as one entity. So in this 1,000 years we've just galloped through with some very vague, sketchy pictures, I know, but it gives you an idea. In this 1,000 years, the island of Britain was invaded 3 times. The Romans, the Anglo-Saxons and the Scots, and the Normans. Ireland is still not been invaded. Now that's all about to change because by the 12th century, the Normans have taken Ireland as well. And the new Norman aristocracy is now pretty much in control of everything. So it's very important to understand that process, that Britain went through all these different invasions that Ireland didn't experience. So leaving history aside, how do we know about the gods of Ireland and Britain? In both places, people were beginning to record things in writing by about the 6th century, let's say. Most of this writing was done in monasteries, which became seats of learning. So a lot of the writing was about Christianity. But they wrote down all sorts of things. Latin was widely known, so they copied out interesting Latin texts. They wrote down poetry, old poetry, new poetry. They wrote down the genealogies. So all of this stuff had been kept by the poets and bards and Fili who had probably grown out of the Druids, which we talked about a couple of Facebook Lives back. You can probably find that on the Facebook page or on my YouTube channel. I think it's called Sorting Out the Druids. So the pedigrees of the rich and famous were recorded in these genealogies, and they often trace themselves back to the gods, amazingly enough. There are a lot more Irish manuscripts of an early date that have survived, and some of these contain copies of even earlier work, and some of these include stories we might think of as mythology. And some of these do openly refer to certain characters in the stories as gods or goddesses. That might be because they already had it in writing from texts we don't have anymore. And once something's in writing, people do love to just perpetuate it. So just occasionally we see certain deities actually openly referred to as deities, like the Dagda and the Morrigan and Bridget. We hear about the Tuatha De Danann, who are kind of a godlike race or a race of gods, depending on how you want to interpret what it says in the texts. That's Ireland in a nutshell, in the early years and early centuries of writing down the mythology. In Wales, we have fewer surviving early manuscripts. And the material which seems to be about deities never says outright that they are deities. So why is it that the Welsh texts don't talk about them as deities? Well, remember all that history we've just talked about. There was a lot of cultural change in Britain and a lot of suppression of British culture, native British culture. I'm not talking about the British Empire here. I'm talking about ancient Britain, right? There was a lot of suppression by the Romans, by the Saxons, as well as by early Christianization. Remember, also a little earlier than in Ireland. The manuscripts themselves, the ones we have, are slightly later. So Christianity is even more deeply embedded in the culture. So I can't think of an instance in the Mabinogi or the Book of the Taliesin of a character being called a god or a goddess. If you read the Mabinogi without any knowledge of Celtic deities, without any knowledge of the Irish texts, you might not think that these are stories about gods. And that's how a lot of Welsh people who grew up learning this stuff in school as their national literature think about it. They don't think so much that Rhiannon is a goddess or Bendigeidfran is a god. It's becoming more widespread now as pagan culture gets kind of mixed into the British culture in a new way. But certainly historically, they haven't thought about it like that. So if you compare the early texts of Ireland and Wales, you'll notice that some of the characters' names are cognate. So by cognate, I mean the way that Mary and Maria in English and Spanish are cognate names, or the way Carl and Charles are cognate names in Germany and English, right? Okay. So for instance, the god Lu in the Irish lore and the god Lle. Now I'm calling him a god. He's not called a god in the literature. So Lu and Lle are cognates. Blathnat and Bledeith are cognates. Govnu and Govanen. Danu and Don, probably. There's some discussion about that one, but I think they are. I think they're cognates. we can infer that at one point, some point in history, in the history of British mythology and indigenous religion, the stories in the Mabinogi have grown out of mythology about the gods. But to say that these specific stories are still stories of the gods is a little inaccurate. It's probably better to say they contain echoes of stories of the gods. They contain a very strong echo of the mythology, but it's a little different than the Irish stories for that reason. So in the case of the four, I've just mentioned the four deities that I mentioned as cognates, and there's a lot more, especially with the gods, not so much with the goddesses. Goddesses seem to be much more localized, whereas gods seem to be more portable. So Lu and Hle, for example, they're both young heroes. They have convoluted stories surrounding their conception and their birth, and both seem to be sort of proteges of greater powers who set them on a predestined course. Blathnat and Bledeith both end up in marriages they didn't choose. They collude with their lovers to have their husbands killed and so on. In a different sort of example, the story of Rhiannon in the Mabinogi and the story of Macha in the Ulster cycle have like 10 or 12 points of similarity in the plot, even though the two goddesses have names which are not cognate at all. Now, because of the Roman habit of writing inscriptions to deities in Britain, starting in the 1st century, we do know the names of some local deities in Britain. And some of these have cognates, which figures in the later Welsh texts, like there are inscriptions to Maponos, and we have Mabon ap Modron, which means essentially the same thing, in the Welsh texts. We have the big temple to Nodens in Gloucestershire, and we have a god called Nidd in the Welsh literature, who's mainly known because he has a much more famous son called Gwyn ap Nidd, who I'm sure some of you have heard of. So the original question was, why are the Tuatha Dé Danann called gods in Irish myth, but no one is ever called a god in Welsh myth? I think part of the original question might be a concern as to whether we should consider things like the Mabinogi to be talking about the gods. And also maybe even a concern, which I'm picking up in some polytheist circles, as to whether we should consider literary characters to be deities at all. So to the first part, whether this is talking about the gods, yes and no. By the time the Mabinogi was written down, certainly not consciously, but nevertheless, the stories were still carrying immense mythological material. So myth, as far as I'm concerned, is very powerful, and it has a lot of staying power in a culture. So even when people forget some of the meaning behind their myths, if they're seeing those myths as so important that they're retaining them, writing them down centuries later, many centuries later, then those myths still have power to act on a culture. And that, in combination with the cognates, says absolutely these are deities. I think as hard polytheists, we can get a little too bit fixed on the name of the deity. If that's your only defining feature, let's just take Rhiannon as an example. Maybe Rhiannon was called Epona or Modron or something else at the time when the indigenous British were worshipping a horse goddess. Maybe Rhiannon is a later addition, a more comfortable name for some reason. Doesn't really matter. It's the essence of the deities that comes through. If there was a concern behind that question about are the characters in the Mabinogi deities, yeah, some of them, I believe, definitely are. You know, you get into personal theology here. Everybody has to figure that part out ultimately for themselves. But I think the cognate nature of many of their names confirms their status as deities. between Britain and Ireland and Gaul. It's up to each person to figure out who's a deity. Even in Irish lore, is every member of the Tua De Danann a deity? I've heard that discussion many times. They're too numerous almost for us to deal with. Many of them we don't know anything about, except maybe their name is mentioned. We pick out the ones that seem important to us, and we treat them as deities. And I think the same has to be said for what we find in the Welsh medieval texts. But I certainly believe that the reason they're not called deities is merely the way history and culture played out in Britain.